So this is our fourth and final webinar in our series for Customer Centricity Month 2022. And before I hand over to today's speakers, Giles and Alberta, and while people are still tuning in, I just wanted to say hi and introduce exactly what Customer Centricity Month is. And sorry to those of you who'll be hearing this for the fourth time. So I'm Lauren, I work in the marketing and events team at CXPartners. At CXPartners, we work with organizations to drive growth, unlock opportunities, and enable teams to work together more effectively. We do this through our research programs, user-centered design, and by embedding a culture of customer centricity within organizations. Early this year, we launched our Customer Centricity Model, which is the culmination of a study and detailed research piece with over 100 European brands into what builds a highly resilient and successful organization. Our Customer Centricity Model and the 5 dimensions that it consists of were created so that organizations could easily assess the areas of their business where there's opportunity for improvement. If you haven't already, I really recommend you take our self-assessment, which will give you a customer centricity score and recommendations for how you can improve. We'll share a link in the chat for that in a moment. We've also launched Customer Centricity Month to dive into the details of the dimensions from our model. So in our webinars so far, we've heard about the process, governance, and facilities dimensions. If you missed any of these sessions, we'll share links in the chat again, and you can catch up on it another time. So in today's session, we'll cover the final 2 dimensions from our study, which are people and communication. So I'm going to hand over to today's speakers. Giles is CXPartners CEO, and he's going to be leading today's session. And then we'll hand over to our brilliant guest speaker, Alberta, who is the Global Head of Customer Experience at Vodafone Business. There'll be time at the end for questions, but please do add them to the Q&A or the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll run through as many as possible at the end. So Giles, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Lauren, and it's great to be here. So we wanted to talk about those last two dimensions, and just to recap what Lauren said. Over the last couple of years, we've been studying scale organizations around Europe to look at how customer centric they are, and whether or not that actually mattered, whether or not that made a difference to those organizations. And so I'd just like to begin there, really. When we looked at the results of our survey, I think that the striking thing was that the organizations that were high customer centricity organizations were also high performing organizations. And what we meant by that was that they had considerably higher growth in revenue than the rest. So that those sort of top scoring organizations outperformed the rest by a factor of 9 times in terms of growth. They were also far more nimble, and so they were able to deliver change far faster, again, than the rest. And they had way higher levels of employee satisfaction. And what's striking to me about those performance measures is, if you think about the world we're living in today, so a world where we're facing a recession or stagnation, that's exactly the question that companies are asking. How do we grow through this period? You think about the challenges of an increasingly chaotic, unpredictable world. Organizations are asking themselves, how can we become more nimble? And a world where there's a fight for talent, how is it that we attract and retain talent? And so I think customer centricity has something to say about all of those key business challenges. It's worth unpacking what we mean by customer centricity. And over the last month, as Lauren said, we've covered what with CXPartners have called the sort of the 5 dimensions of that. When we were looking at organizations, we considered 5 aspects that give us a kind of a very rounded picture of what was going on in those organizations. And they were process. In other words, what are the procedures that the organization follows to get stuff done? How are change programs or projects managed from beginning to end? What's the governance around that? In other words, how does the organization choose its priorities, decide where to spend cash? How do stakeholders looking at projects from the outside determine whether or not those projects are on track or not, and what they need to do to support those projects when they're going off track? What are the the facilities, the software, the spaces, the tools that the employees are given to help them get their jobs done. What are people? What roles does the organization have? What skills does the organization have? How is its org chart handled? And what's communicated? So what information is passed to whom and when? Those 5 dimensions give us a very rounded picture of the organization, and we're able to see the organization's capability within each of those, and that enables us in turn to think about the organization's maturity on its journey towards customer centricity, whether it's a new organization where it's just not following any kind of customer centric approaches, and we often see services failing there, or whether it's achieved a sort of maximum highest level on a maturity score, and it's become famous for its customer organization, for its customer experience. What we found when we looked at the data was that on average, organizations were around about 3.2. So the numerical average average score was 3.2, but also that was the modal score. Most organizations seem to be stuck in this sort of messy middle of 3, where they got themselves to a point where products and services were perfectly usable but not differentiated. The very best, though, were absolutely famous for that customer experience. And it's curious to say, well, what is the difference between the average and the best? Of each of those 5 dimensions, the dimension which had the greatest difference, the biggest gap between the best and the rest, was communication. And it was absolutely striking how the highest performing organizations were also ones that scored highly on talking within the organization. That was top down. That was about management making teams throughout the organization aware of strategic goals. It was bottom up, teams reporting back on performance, or this is what's happening on the front line. And it was about information sharing across the organization. So people within the organization sharing their knowledge with each other. And I find that really remarkable, because when you talk to people about information sharing within organizations, most of the time they talk about what pain it is. They talk about drowning in too much information. They talk about having too many meetings to go to. And a lot of managers take that as, well, we need to reduce that information burden that's on people. In fact, one of the questions that we asked was, do you provide teams with a broad strategic overview so they know what all of the teams are trying to do, or do you just give them their own strategic goals? And the organizations that scored lowest, the low performing organizations, were the ones that said, we let teams focus on their goals. The organizations that performed highest were the ones that said, we let them know what everyone's doing. We want them to know what everyone is up to. So I find that a slightly surprising outcome, that actually this sort of additional information sharing was so important to performance. But it was not anything that was being shared. Actually, those organizations were when you looked at the roles within those organizations, the people that they had, you could see that those organizations were prizing certain types of information. And right across the board, we saw that roles that were to do with gathering information about customers, or distilling information about customers, or redistributing information about customers, those were roles that were about twice as present in high-performing organizations as the rest. So it's what I take from that is, well, it doesn't look like it's just any information that's being shared. It's very specific information. It's information about, this is how we're going to help our customers. This is what our customers are saying or doing. This is what's working or not working. And sure enough, when we went back to those leading organizations and said, okay, this is what we've seen, tell us about what it's like within your organizations. I think that that sort of instinct from the data was absolutely borne out. Those organizations were what you might call learning organizations. The thing they wanted to learn and the thing they wanted to share was what matters to our customers. If I were to boil it down, I would say actually those organizations had created that culture of customer centricity. And I think culture is such an important tool in managing and leading organizations, because culture gives people a sense of, well, what might you do, even if it's not codified, even if it's not written down in your process guidelines, even if it's not written down in your governance rules, even if it's not something that's suggested by the software and tools that we've given you. Culture helps people to understand, well, am I pointing in the right direction? Am I doing something that's broadly going to work or not? And of course, we're all facing new situations all the time. Nevertheless, when I think about culture, it's one of those things that seems sort of difficult to pin down, and yet I believe it's something that you can design. I believe it's something you can go into an organization and start to pick apart. And so I'd like to talk about how we've done that. I think the first thing is that culture is not about whether we're allowed to wear flip-flops in the office. It's much deeper and far more subtle than those sort of surface things about Friday afternoon drinks or daily rituals that we often kind of pick out. I think the culture emerges from values and behavior. In other words, what do we think is important? What does success look like? What are we running towards? And what does danger look like? What are we trying to run away from? And what behaviors do we think will get us to success or keep us safe from danger? And at its heart, all of those things, desire for informality, a desire for rigor, are really about the things that a particular organization considers will bring it success or keep it safe from danger. So if you're trying to design culture, you really need to start with those sorts of questions. The other thing I think it's worth saying is that organizations have within them subcultures. So the organization will have a particular overarching set of values which determine the organization's culture. And that's a flavor that runs through everything. But you'll also find within those organizations management groups and teams that are managed by them, each with their own different culture. And so when you're trying to design culture, I think it's important to be aware of all of those things, the underlying values and behaviors that the organization wants to see, and then the organization, the values and behaviors of a smaller group, maybe the thing that you're working on, the team that you're working with. A few years ago, we were brought into an organization and asked, can you help us to rethink the way that we're running design in this organization, because it's failing. And I think the management diagnosis of that was, we have we're a team that's just not good enough. So we're unable to hang on to the best people. The ones that we're left with, they're not the most dogged or the most committed. Oh no, they're just the worst. And look at the results we're getting. It's not good enough. And we suspected that it was more complicated than that it was about the relationship between the organization and what it was trying to do with design. So we began by just looking at by doing a cultural survey of that group and saying, what is the culture like today, and what culture do you think you'd like to have? What would make things better? And what that helped us to do was to define the design problem, right? It helps us to make that visual. So we used a culture mapping technique called the competing values framework. And what that helped us to call out was that today, the as-is state was actually a very hierarchical management. So there's a lot of focus on chain of command, which meant that decisions were slow, decisions were not necessarily informed by what was going on the ground, and very target driven. So a particular goal had been set, and people were steered towards that no matter what. And when we looked at the culture that the organization wanted to have, there was a big shift there towards something that was far more devolved and far more focused on outcomes, and making that visible to people, making the change visible, and putting it in terms that allowed them to think about behaviors, and allowed them to think about what was going on. It opened up a conversation, and allowed us then to start working with the stakeholders and with the teams themselves to say, okay, well, what are the behaviors that will bring about these sorts of changes, and how would you be acting every day? And from that, we were able to pull together, well, here is a list of behaviors that we think should underpin everything that we do. It's not exactly this list of behaviors, but this is a good starting point, I think, for anybody thinking about embedding customer centricity more deeply. So we win by delivering customer value, by testing our assumptions, by iterating, and by collaborating across different disciplines. We pulled together, based on this particular organization's needs, this particular organization's results, a more detailed version of this, a set of behaviors that they could put on the wall and say, well, this is how we intend to behave. And we then were able to go back to each of those dimensions and say, well, what would that do to this? So what does that say about the job descriptions that we have for people, about the personal goals that we set them, and about the how people are evaluated and judged? We changed those job descriptions and changed those roles and identified gaps in the hierarchy. We thought very much about the need to create a new culture, and therefore to create a new space for people to come into, to give them some physical cues to say things are going to be done differently from now on and in this space. And so we actually set up a completely new office space. We redesigned it, made it look different, made it feel different, made sure there was lots of collaboration spaces, made sure that there were places to put stuff on the wall, which hadn't been allowed before. Made sure that there were facilities to bring members of the public in safely and securely, so that they could run their own user research. We looked at their processes and about how and when they were expected to talk to the public, and of course their governance, about the ways in which teams were questioned about what was going on. And we looked at communication, everything from making sure there was a routine around stand-up to how people were, again, brought into the office from outside, what they were told about what to expect, how progress was reported, and how that team also got to talk about its successes and explain the changes that it was bringing about. So a complete program to kind of reset the culture for that team around the goals that we've been able to identify with them, and to bring it into a much more customer-centric space. And what that meant was, within a matter of weeks, we were able to transform the output of that team and actually bring it into that kind of high performance space, and start being able to say, look, here's some evidence that we're changing the way that that things are happening around here. I think you also need to be able to maintain a culture. It's not just about a one-time reset. And there, I think this Venn diagram from a consultant called Dave Gray is one of my favorites about explaining culture, because every organization has two cultures. It has the spoken culture, who we say we are, what we say we do, and it has the acted culture, what we actually do, how we actually behave. And those things never quite line up, but you want them to overlap. You want these two things to be pushed together as tightly as possible. So we say what we mean, and we mean what we say. In a lot of organizations, though, that drifts apart. And Dave Gray has a very clear name for that. And that bullshit gap that emerges when organizations say they want thing and then want one thing and then reward another, leads to cynicism, leads to low morale, And it leads to this sort of slightly weird situation that you get in organizations where you know that just because somebody said they wanted one thing doesn't mean you're actually going to get rewarded, and the people who do the other thing are the ones who get rewarded. The question then is, well, if that's the tendency, these things tend to kind of move apart and fantasy takes over from reality. How do you push them back together? And I think part of any change program is about embedding a feedback culture in the organization. So it's about giving people ways of saying, hey, these two things are not the same, that are safe for them to say. So they're not going to feel like they're going to be attacked for calling out bullshit, and that are heard and listened to, and that people who are being called out feel comfortable with hearing that feedback, so that you can push these two things back into alignment. And I think one of the things that's important, therefore, if you're working on changing the culture in an organization to do, is to make sure all of that is underpinned with clear, safe ways of presenting feedback. And that's, I think, one of the ways in which you maintain and grow and reinforce the culture. So our maturity scale, I think, that difference between the messy middle, 3, where we found a lot of organizations have bits of what they need to be customer centered, but not done in a kind of a systematic way, is where most of the organizations we deal with find themselves today. Systematizing that and filling in the gaps is a big step towards customer centricity, but the organizations that really win, the organizations that absolutely knock it out of the park, are the ones for me where they've gone beyond that visible, written down, documented approach, and they're able to embed it in culture and therefore adapt to the unknown, the unexpected situations that we face every day. At its heart, I think culture is about a theory of success, and the critical thing that we heard from the organizations that were absolutely at the top of that tree was the deep-seated belief that they win, but not by balancing the books. Balancing the books comes from delivering customer value. That they win not by having a stellar sales organization. Stellar sales organization comes from delivering customer value. That all of the good stuff flows from a focus on and attention to customer value, and that powered the conversations that were happening in those organizations. It meant that they were prepared to invest in the right roles. That meant that they were able to collect the right data, understand it, and share it, and ultimately led to their success. I'm joined today by Alberta Soranzo, who is a global head of customer experience for Vodafone Business. So she's working within a massive scale organization to create change and to embed change. So hi Alberta.
Hi Giles, thanks. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for actually putting the focus on the importance of culture in leading change programs and in supporting the efforts towards customer centricity, because it's not a given in large organizations.
I'm curious, because you work in large organizations and you've done this throughout your career, and I'm invited in to help support those changes. What happens after the consultants leave? What's the job that you're doing?
I don't know if I can tell you, because then that gives you a competitive advantage. No, but seriously. And so let me preface with something. Yes, most of my career has been spent in-house or client side, but I've had a number of experiences in consulting. So I was on the side you're on right now, And then I figured that I would try to work with very good consultants to push change from the inside. As to what happens when the consultants leave, I suppose it depends. And I know it depends sounds like a non-committal type of answers, but there are several factors at play. The internal factors are just as important as the external ones. So for people to adopt a culture, and yes, you're right, culture can be designed, can be an intentional effort, but in order for people to embrace any type of change, they have to feel a certain degree of ownership in it. And, when you work with a variety of consultancies and partners, even with colleagues, there are people that do things to you and people that do things with you. So if the approach of the consultancies is, unfortunately, we see that very rarely, these days, is we come in, we're super smart, here's what you need to do, thank you very much. It is very probable that there will not be a really long-lasting effect. What we're seeing right now is that when the organization has the chance to participate in making a decision by being part of discovery, of workshop, of helping to shape the the program of change, the impact is much stronger. Having said that, consultants leave, then the ball is firmly in the organization's court. So it is up to leadership to role model the kind of change you want to see. So you were showing that matrix moving from a hierarchical, controlled, authoritarian type of culture to one with a lot more discretion. Unless management or senior leadership embodies these values that they are espousing without the need for feedback initially, because initially it needs to be a really intentional effort. If they don't bridge right off the bat that gap between what we say and what we actually do, every effort is going to fall apart. In my experience, people who work in an organization on the whole have a very clear idea of what works and what doesn't work. But we often don't have the perspective. We're very invested in the things that we do and in the things that we would like to do and how we would like to do them. So the role of the consultant is instrumental in helping you codify a path for going from A to B, and also helping you identify who is going to help your role model and lead along that path, who is going to be the champion, because the effort needs to happen at every level of the organization. And also, how do you preserve the existing value and the foundational intents of the organization? Because if you have, unless you have these sort of like beacons of directionality, intentionality, you're going to lose your sense of self, you're going to lose your sense of purpose, you're going to lose your sense of value. And of course, when you look at this internal signposting efforts, they, as you were saying, they need to be supported by a very clear vision, goals, with customer value being of course, the ultimate goal, that continue to reinforce the change you want to make.
And it sounds like also one of the things you're saying is you want leadership to model that change. It must
100%.
must be very easy for small slips to be read as so the old ways are still okay, and that modeling needs to be quite dramatic.
It does. It's a little bit in other contexts, but I think it applies to this one as well. I compare leadership to parenting. The kids, when you have kids, kids are always watching. And if you tell them, don't put your fingers in your nose, and then when you think they're not looking, you sneak a little scratch, they're going to see it. And as you were saying, they're going to think, well, it's okay, if they do it. So consistency and commitment to your stated ambition, in this case, change. So what you say is absolutely fundamental. And it has to apply to everybody. I've seen in organizations where I've been where certain type of allowances were made for particular groups, and of course it dilutes the meaning and it dilutes the credibility of leadership. I am lucky to work in an organization where there is an incredible consistency in between the message and the behavior. And I can see the shift very clear in front of my eyes.
I'm curious about that because if you're creating a change program, then inevitably all of the people, especially the senior levels of an organization, but right the way through the middle of the organization, are going to feel like, well, I got to where I am now because of the old way of doing things. And how do you create change when people people feel like they've got a vested interest in the status quo?
Well, that is it's a very interesting question. And you're right. It's a lot of people who have been in a certain industry and a certain role have learned how that system. So you were talking about culture and subcultures. It's also systems and subsystems and ecosystems. So they've learned to be very successful by a certain standard, by doing certain things. And of course, when you suggest any type of change, there is a direct threat to the status quo, to the potential future well-being, et cetera, et cetera. The way I have approached this type of challenge is by demonstrating practical value. Effectively, whenever you initiate a program of change, you're taking a leap of faith. You're gambling that doing something different from what you've always done will yield better results. So if you can find a little corner of the organization or a big corner of the organization, depending on what your radius of impact is, and demonstrate actually that this new approach or this different way of doing things, this different way of interpreting the founding values can be successful, then it becomes a little contagious. Everybody wants a little bit of the pixie dust. And I remember.
Example? Okay. Yeah. I was going to say, have you got an example?
Yes. I have one that is brilliant. In one of my past roles, we were working on a financial product. We're working on mortgages, and let's just say that our customer feedback was not exceptional. And this was a financial institution that positioned itself as, the a financial institution for everybody. Feedback was not, and service were not exceptional. And one of the main areas of complaint was the fact that it was taking too long between the application for the mortgage and the mortgage being in the customer's hands. So, traditionally in a large institution, you would start creating a business case. You would, you would create a roadmap. You would probably spread the work over a certain number of quarters, et cetera, et cetera. And we were able to obtain permission to run this change program in a slightly different way. So what we did was we requisitioned the room when rooms were still a thing, if you will. We ran an in-depth analysis of everything that was happening between when the customer picked up the phone or filled the form and when they had the money in their account, and physically mapped this process to understand where where our SLAs, so our service level agreements were, how long they were, how they worked one after the other. And where I'm not going to go into specific numbers, we had a staggering number of, process points that could all be respected with their SLAs, so everything could be on green. And an SLA, for those who don't know, is effectively a promise to do or a commitment to do a thing by a certain time, right? SLA 7 days, meaning this process needs to be closed in 7 days. So everything could be absolutely fine, yet the concatenation of all these events took a very long time. Now, financial services is a regulated industry, so you can't willy-nilly pick what you do and what you don't. But we were able to strip down this process to the things that were regulated, that we were mandated to do in order to keep both the customer and the organization safe and make sure that we wouldn't end up lending money to people who shouldn't be lent to. And that number of SLAs reduced drastically. What we did, as I said, we, in this room, not only we had the whole process map on the wall, but we also had every person who was responsible for that type of for that bit of the service in the same room. And we started diverting some applications rather than through the old process, through the new one. A little bit like old contact centers, if you will, where you can lift your head, take a look at the board and know that Mr. Giles Colborne has passed all these things. There's only this one step. And so irrespective of who picked up the phone, everybody knew. And so we were trying to avoid that dreaded call center syndrome, I call it, where you call a company that you've done business with and every time for a number of years, and every time you have to tell your whole story from start, right? And they tell you, wait a second, I'll check the records, et cetera, et cetera. So to get to the point, after a short amount of time, we were able to demonstrate to the organization that we could streamline the process, so make it a lot more effective and a lot less costly from the point of view of the organization, increase the customer satisfaction, because of course we had the ability to flex the duration of the process to what they needed. And we were also spending a lot less money in responding to what we call failure demand. So all these, all the
people phoning up saying, "Where's my mortgage?"
Yeah. No, but also people asking, where is my application? Or I sent the documents 3 days ago. You're telling me now that you need the documents again, et cetera, et cetera. Those are real costs for the organization. Once we were able to start producing proof, tangible proof that this type of approach, this completely revamped type of processing actually meant an increase in customer satisfaction and an increase in revenue and a decrease in cost for the organization. Everybody else in the organization, every other unit wanted to use the same approach.
There's a saying, isn't there? Nothing succeeds like success, and I guess sort of making that success visible, tangible, real. Again, it comes back to communicating that success. But I think the other thing I'm hearing there is just pulling people out of their normal environment again, and saying, okay, we're now in a new space, and we're now in a place where you can try things differently and be differently and see what's working, and that gives you a chance to stage the new culture. It gives you a chance to stage a change in the way we do things around here, and change the way that work happens.
Yes, and I think another byproduct of that type of setup, certainly it was in our case, was the fact that the colleagues that were involved in the process, in this experiment, became fierce advocates of this change. They became, their satisfaction scores went up, and it's clearly the scores are just the representation of a feeling, but they're the employee satisfaction was contagious. Everybody wanted.
A huge thing about making change happen in large organizations is there's because change affects how people are judged, it affects what people need to do to be successful. It's always a political thing, and what you're saying there about people's sort of success measures is you in a lot of organizations you're trying to create change by getting everyone on board, and there are always people who won't want to get on board, and if you focus on the people who do want change and show that they can succeed, then as you say, afterwards everyone is phoning up saying, well, we want some of this, we'd like to do this too. And it's better to concentrate on those bright spots than to try and get everyone on board. I wondered also about, just as a leader, what qualities you think you need to create change.
There are a number of qualities that I think are important. But the one that stands out for me is definitely courage. Change is scary, and change is risky. As you were mentioning, there's the risk of doing things in a way that I don't know. I know that the old system has always been successful for me. I'm sticking my neck out in a way, politically, because large organizations also have, if not outright politics, but they have very well set ways of self-governance, if you will. So courage is contagious, like successful change. And courage is what is needed in order to create these pockets of possibility. And, so I stick my neck out to create this little experiment. You're more willing to stick your neck out to participate in this type of experiment. And it becomes this this sort of cascade of good qualities that are fundamental for change programs to be lasting. I think courage engenders trust and the ability of letting go of the delusion of control, which in turn becomes, because we can control anything, right? I mean, we can control a lot of things, but it is a bit of a delusion, I think. There's also something that derives from trust and the ability of letting go. And it's this kind of like renewed belief that people are going to do the right thing by the organization. There's some, I mean, I don't want to get into old management theories, but when this organizational psychologist McGregor was running experiments, he was noticing that in organizations that are more traditionally resistant to change and doing things in a way, there was this hierarchical approach where I know best, people need to be managed, people cannot be trusted. And organizations where there was this recognition, there was this sense of trust, this sense of, believing that people who brought their own expertise would do the right thing by the organization. Change, innovation, progression were happening in a different way. But I think that the basis is courage. It's where an organization starts. I have the courage to invent a wheel. I have the courage to put something together, and how organizations grow.
That's fantastic. So change is something that needs to be done with people. You need to create spaces for change and bring the willing into those spaces to show them it's safe to experiment and to demonstrate success. And you need the courage to take, I think, as you said, you used the phrase a number of times, that leap of faith in the change that you want to create. That's fantastic. And I'd like to throw those questions open to those of you out there who've been listening to us talk about culture, communication, and change. And what questions that's raised for you.
Great, thank you both. That was so interesting. Thank you for running through that. I can see a couple of questions have come through already whilst you've been talking, which we can go through. But yeah, as you said, Giles, if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat and we'll go through them. So the first question that we've had is, can you give an example of when you've seen a direct link between a great culture impacting a great customer experience?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think I was lucky enough to do a bit of work with Martin Lewis, money saving expert, and that really showed me how this sort of singular belief in what it is it takes to be successful really shaped his organization and shaped the brand that he was creating. And Money Saving Experts is an incredible brand. It's the sort of thing where Martin Lewis says something and it literally changes. Google know that the minute that newsletter, his weekly newsletter, lands in people's inboxes, it will change search rankings in the UK. And working alongside him, you heard everything he was doing came from this belief that we need to be seen to be on the side of the customer. And that needs to therefore be apparent in everything, every little detail of what we do, and in meetings and reviews and communications with staff. That was a point he emphasized again and again. There's a line here. There's the organizations on one side, there's the customer on the other, and we belong on the customer's side. So I remember talking through a product design with him, where his team were interested in sharing advice on vouchers and offers and deals each week. And there's a lot of websites out there that do that, which essentially are not on the side of the customer, and they're about they're about getting some they're marketing tools for aggregating links, and Martin Lewis wanted you to visually see this was not about the brands, this was about you as the customer. And we needed the brands' logos to be there because people would recognize, Burger King or Marks and Spencer's by those logos. And it was a usability thing. Have those logos, it's easier to see what's going on. But also have those logos and it looks like you've crossed over onto the wrong side of the line. And so, important thing was making sure we kind of pulled that back. Went, okay, well, we are going to reduce the size. We're going to take them into grayscale. We're going to make them look a bit, enough like things to be a visual cue, which is what we wanted, but not like things to make them look as though they're on the other side. And I think it's that singular understanding of what it is that we do that makes us different and successful, that then flows through into 100 little decisions, something you could never codify before, but also gives you that incredible brand power and that trust that nobody else has in that space. So I think that sort of sense of identity and sense of who you are, and then building that into the culture of how we do things, of what our work looks like, of what that means for the little decisions that we take, was absolutely at the core of his success. It's fascinating to watch.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question that we've had is, how can other non-senior leaders of the organization impact the senior leadership teams to see the need for cultural change that will then bring the actual change of that organization's culture?
I think that's a great question. I have some thoughts on that. Alberta, do you as well? I can see you smiling.
I think it's an excellent question, and possibly an incredible point of frustration potentially for people who might have the perspective but feel that they don't have an impact. I think, and then I answer assuming that most people we work with are open-minded enough to be willing to listen. The advice I would give is to take a step back and think about the fact that you are in the position that you are because someone trusted you to be there. Someone respects your expertise and your professionalism and your domain mastery. So that's, if there is an element of insecurity in going to in making suggestions to senior leadership, please try not to think about it. Then there is the what I would suggest is preparing. So a lot of in a lot of organizations I've worked, I've seen people coming with the best intentions and a half-baked kind of proposal. The idea was phenomenal, but in situations where there is a scarcity of time, there's also a scarcity of patience. So senior leadership is a lot less inclined to listen to me if I go to them and say, oh, I have an idea, and by the way, yeah, I've not figured out how to do it, but here's what we should do. And then I would say it's always because especially in large organizations, there is the issue of or the challenge of risk management. I would, make sure that I look out in the market to bring forth examples and materials that back up your thesis. I find that as intimidating as certain organizational figures can be, most everybody is actually incredibly reasonable, both collectively and individually, and have a genuine desire to lead the organization well. We also have massive blind spots. There are, not everybody can know everything, and new ideas, new suggestions actually are incredibly welcome. It might not be said openly, but there absolutely is a space for meaningful discourse and communication. not just from the top down, but from the bottom up, I would say.
Yeah,
I don't know how much you agree or disagree, Giles.
No, I think I'd echo a lot of those points. I think it always strikes me, if you want people to listen to you, generally the best place to begin is to listen to them, right? So you know, if what you're saying is, well, how do I convince senior leadership to be part of this? I think it's worth saying, beginning with that question, what is it that you want, and what does, you know, success look like, and how would you like things to be in 5-10 years time? Enough time that we're not kind of tethered to something that's sort of pressing and urgent, but that kind of vision. Where do you want to go? And I think in listening to that, you'll probably hear that a lot of the outcomes that you want, as Alberta says, are aligned. And so if you walk in with the position, like, here's a reasonable person who wants what's right for the organization, I want to listen and learn about that. First of all, you learn where you line up with what it is that they want to do, and you can build on that. You can build on where there's positive alignment. And secondly, you increase your credibility, because you recognize you don't have all of the answers, and that gives them space to recognize that, you know, maybe they don't have all the answers too. So I do think, you know, if you want to be listened to, you need to begin by listening. And then I think what you find within any organization is that there are always people who want the same sorts of changes as you do, and probably more than you think. And you need to build a team of the willing. And as Alberta says, that runs throughout the organization. That certainly you need senior management cover, but you also need people right the way through to make that happen. And so you need to find those people at every level. And that then gives you, you know, the opportunity to say, okay, well, let's go away and let's demonstrate success. Let's say what we can do, and do some of the other things that we were talking about today. If I were to boil it down to one thing, though, I'd say, if you want to be listened to, make sure you begin by listening. It's an incredibly powerful, underrated tool.
Absolutely. And actually, for everybody's peace of mind, I want to share a tiny anecdote and something that happened to me in a previous job. I had a mentor who was at exco level. And, you know, of course, we met at crazy hours because their schedule was all over the place. And I remember one particular evening, I was in their office, and we'd gotten friendly over the months that this person had been mentoring me. And they told me that they were about to retire. And so I asked him, I said, okay, so you need to compile a list of all the things that I need to keep in mind for when you're no longer around and I cannot bounce stuff around you. And the thing that they told me that stuck with me the most is that in large organizations, or he said organization like ours, the people who are at the top, they think that they have to project this aura of knowing everything. So he was saying, I am supposed to know absolutely everything there is to know. And if anybody comes to me with an answer, I need to give them an answer no matter what. The reality is that I don't know the answer to everything, but I am scared as hell to admit it. And so if you keep that in mind, keep in mind that the person who is in front of you, who you're trying to influence, who you've listened, expressing problems that they're trying to find a solution for, they might not have the answers. And what you're about to propose could be the one thing that they're looking for. Of course, you want to be sensitive. You don't want to walk into an office and say, you're a dinosaur, you don't understand anything, let me fix it for you. That'll get you fired. But people want to know. And sometimes they feel that they can say, I don't know.
Brilliant, that's lovely. Thank you so much both. I think unfortunately that's all the time we've got for questions, but sorry to anyone whose question we didn't get around to. If you would like them answering, please do send them across to marketing@cxpartners.co.uk and we'll ask Giles and Alberta to answer them offline for you. So just to wrap up quickly, this has been our last webinar of Customer Centricity Month. We've been so thrilled with how many people have signed up to the sessions. So thank you to everyone that's joined us over the last 4 weeks. We'll be collating all of the talks and writing up blogs and sharing all of this content with you over the next week or so. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today. And just a final thank you to Giles and Alberta for hosting such a great session.